Have you ever watched a basketball game where the final score made it look competitive, but the game itself told a completely different story? Because that's exactly what this felt like. On paper, the Indiana Fever put up plenty of points. Their biggest star delivered another impressive offensive performance. Several players reached double figures. At different moments, it even looked like they might steal the game. But if you actually watched every possession, every defensive mistake, every missed opportunity, and every moment where the energy simply disappeared, you probably walked away asking one question. What happened? This wasn't just about missing shots. It wasn't just about turnovers. It wasn't even about one bad quarter. It felt like a team that never truly matched the intensity of the moment. And when your franchise player is having another outstanding offensive night, that's a frustrating way to lose. So let's break everything down from the beginning. The opening minutes immediately felt strange. Sometimes you can tell within the first 2 or 3 possessions whether a team is mentally locked in. Their defensive rotations are sharp. Players communicate. Everyone moves with purpose. Every rebound matters. Every loose ball becomes a battle. That wasn't the feeling here. Instead, Indiana looked like a team trying to wake up while the game had already started. There were flashes of good offense. There were moments where Caitlin Clark looked aggressive. Sophie Cunningham also came out with confidence, knocking down shots early and bringing the type of energy fans wanted to see. But outside of those bright moments, everything else seemed disconnected. The ball moved. Players ran their sets. But nothing felt urgent. Nothing felt like a team determined to control the game. Meanwhile, the opponent wasn't playing perfect basketball either. They simply played with more purpose. Every possession mattered. Every attack came with confidence. And slowly, possession by possession, Indiana found itself playing from behind. The frustrating part wasn't the scoreboard. It was the body language. Fans have watched this Fever team enough to know what they're capable of when they're fully engaged. They can play fast. They can spread the floor. They can create open looks. They can force defenses into impossible decisions whenever Caitlin Clark is controlling the pace. But that version of the Fever barely showed up. Instead, possessions became slower. Everything felt predictable. Rather than attacking with speed, the offense often settled into isolation basketball. One player dribbles. Everyone else watches. Another player dribbles. Everyone waits. Then a difficult shot goes up. Sometimes it falls. Sometimes it doesn't. But over the course of a full game, that's incredibly difficult to sustain. The offense was scoring enough to stay close. The defense was creating the real problem. Every time Indiana found a little momentum, it disappeared on the other end. Easy drives. Open lanes. Second chance opportunities. Defensive breakdowns. It became a pattern. Basketball isn't only about making shots. It's about making life difficult for your opponent. Indiana simply didn't do that consistently. One thing that stood out immediately was Caitlin Clark's mindset. From the opening quarter, she looked aggressive. She wasn't waiting for the game to come to her. She attacked. She looked for her own shot. She trusted her range. She mixed in drives. She created opportunities for teammates. It wasn't perfect. There were turnovers early. Some passes didn't connect. Some decisions happened a little too quickly. But none of that changed the overall picture. She looked ready. She looked engaged. She looked like someone trying to lift her team. That's exactly what fans have come to expect. Whether she's making deep three-pointers or threading impossible passes through traffic, she constantly puts pressure on defenses. Even when she isn't scoring, defenders have to account for her every movement. That kind of gravity changes everything. Unfortunately, basketball remains a 5-player game. One great performance can only carry a team so far. The first half became a perfect example of that reality. Indiana continued making shots at a respectable rate. Their offensive numbers weren't terrible. Normally, shooting that efficiently should put a team in control. Instead, they were constantly trying to answer what happened on the other end. Every bucket seemed to be matched, sometimes immediately, sometimes with even easier looks. That became incredibly frustrating. Because no matter how well the offense responded, the defense couldn't generate enough stops. And without stops, it's almost impossible to build momentum. Momentum comes from defense. Momentum comes from forcing mistakes. Momentum comes from turning rebounds into fast breaks. Instead, Indiana often found itself taking the ball out of the basket after another opponent's score. That changes everything. It slows the pace. It limits transition opportunities. It allows the opposing defense to get organized. Suddenly, every possession becomes harder. That's exactly what unfolded. There were also several coaching decisions that quickly became talking points among fans. When key opposing players dealt with foul trouble, many expected Indiana to attack those matchups aggressively. The idea seemed simple. Force difficult defensive possessions. Pressure players already carrying multiple fouls. Create uncomfortable situations. Instead, Indiana often attacked elsewhere. Whether that was by design or simply how possessions unfolded, many fans questioned the strategy. Because in close games, every small advantage matters. Every matchup matters. Every decision matters. And when opportunities aren't fully used, people notice. As the game continued, another issue became impossible to ignore. The energy inside the arena. Normally, Indiana's home crowd creates one of the loudest environments in the league. Fans stand. They celebrate. Every Caitlin Clark three-pointer brings the building to life. Every defensive stop creates another wave of excitement. This time felt different. There were moments of noise. There were moments of excitement. But overall, the atmosphere never reached the level many expected. Part of that comes from the way a team plays. Crowds feed off emotion. Players feed off crowds. When one side lacks energy, the other often follows. It became a cycle. The quieter the arena became, the flatter the game felt. Still, Caitlin Clark continued attacking. She knocked down difficult shots. She created scoring opportunities. She kept Indiana close. Every time it looked like the game might slip away, she found another answer. That's what stars do. They refuse to disappear. Even when everything around them feels inconsistent, they continue competing. And that's exactly what happened here. Another encouraging sign involved her willingness to take mid-range jumpers. Throughout her career, defenses have focused heavily on taking away her three-point shooting. Expanding the mid-range game creates another challenge. Even if every shot doesn't fall, the willingness to take them matters. Players become more difficult to guard when they threat every level of the floor. That's something worth watching as the season continues. Meanwhile, Aliyah Boston quietly kept doing her job. She battled inside. She finished around the basket. She remained a reliable scoring option whenever Indiana looked for production in the paint. Her second-half performance would become especially important later. But during the opening half, even productive individual performances couldn't hide the larger issue. The team simply wasn't connected. Defense requires trust, communication, effort, 5 players moving together. Whenever one player misses an assignment, everyone else has to adjust immediately. Too often, those adjustments never came. That allowed open driving lanes, late closeouts, easy finishes, second opportunities. Those mistakes don't always show up in highlight clips, but they decide basketball games. The frustrating part was knowing this roster has shown better defensive stretches before. That's why fans expected more. Not perfection, just more consistent effort. Because effort travels. Even when shots stop falling, effort remains. Even when offenses struggle, effort can keep games close. Indiana never consistently found that defensive edge during the first half. Offensively, there were enough bright spots to stay optimistic. Defensively, there were enough warning signs to create real concern. As halftime approached, the scoreboard still suggested this was anyone's game. But watching the flow of the contest told another story. One team looked sharper. One team looked more prepared. One team seemed to understand exactly how it wanted to win. Indiana still had time to respond. They still had one of the league's biggest stars leading the way. And they still had an opportunity to completely change the story. But if they wanted to do that, the second half needed to look dramatically different. Because simply trading baskets wasn't going to be enough. The Fever needed stops. They needed energy. They needed urgency. Most importantly, they needed to start playing like a team that understood how important this game really was. The second half began with a simple question hanging over the entire arena. Would Indiana finally wake up? The answer, at least for a while, was maybe. The offense immediately looked more confident. The ball started moving with a little more purpose. Players attacked the basket instead of settling for difficult shots on every possession. There was finally a sense that the Fever understood the urgency of the moment. And leading that charge, once again, was Caitlin Clark. Every time she touched the basketball, the defense had a decision to make. Step up too high, and she could blow by for a drive. Go under a screen, and she could launch from deep. Send a second defender, and she would immediately find the open teammate. That constant pressure is what makes her so dangerous. Even when she isn't scoring, she's forcing the defense to think. And when defenders start thinking instead of reacting, mistakes happen. Clark recognized those openings. She pushed the pace whenever she could. She attacked gaps before they closed. She mixed perimeter shooting with drives into the paint. She didn't force every possession. She simply kept making the right basketball play. For a few minutes, Indiana looked like a completely different team. The crowd finally started to respond. A made basket led to louder cheers. A defensive stop created real excitement. For the first time all night, the building actually felt alive. This was the version of the Fever fans had been waiting to see. Not perfect, not unstoppable, just competitive, just connected, just willing to fight. Aliyah Boston also became more involved defensively. Instead of waiting for opportunities, she established deep position inside. When the ball reached her, she finished with confidence. Her footwork around the basket forced defenders to stay honest. That opened driving lanes for everyone else. It's easy to forget how valuable a reliable post presence can be. When defenses collapse inside, shooters suddenly have more room. When they stay home on shooters, the post player gets favorable matchups. Everything starts working together. For a brief stretch, Indiana finally looked balanced. Sophie Cunningham continued doing the little things that don't always appear in the box score. She hustled after loose balls. She stayed active without the basketball. She communicated on defense. Those details matter over the course of a game. Championship teams are built on players willing to do those small jobs. Not every contribution comes from scoring 20 points. Sometimes it's one extra rebound, one smart rotation, one screen that frees a teammate. Those moments add up. The problem was that every positive sequence seemed to be followed by another defensive breakdown. Just when Indiana looked ready to take control, they gave up another easy basket. Sometimes it was a missed rotation. Sometimes it was late help. Sometimes an opponent simply drove straight to the rim with very little resistance. No matter how well the offense played, those mistakes erased the progress almost immediately. It became frustrating because the solutions didn't appear impossible. Fans weren't asking for perfection. They simply wanted consistent effort. Fight through every screen. Contest every shot. Protect the paint. Finish defensive possessions with rebounds. Those are basic principles every successful team relies on. Unfortunately, Indiana struggled to maintain them for long stretches. Another storyline continued growing as the game moved deeper into the third quarter. Caitlin Clark's confidence never disappeared. Some players become passive after committing turnovers early. Others hesitate after missing difficult shots. Clark did the opposite. She kept attacking. She kept trusting her instincts. She kept believing the next possession could change everything. That's one of the biggest differences between great players and everyone else. Confidence doesn't disappear after one mistake. It grows stronger. Instead of worrying about the last possession, great players focus entirely on the next one. That's exactly how Clark approached the game. She knocked down another tough shot. She delivered another impressive assist. She pushed the pace after defensive rebounds. She continued creating offense whenever Indiana desperately needed it. By the end of the third quarter, her stat line reflected another outstanding individual performance. She had scored efficiently. She had created opportunities for teammates. She had controlled the tempo whenever the ball was in her hands. From an offensive perspective, she had done almost everything fans could reasonably ask. The question became whether the team could build on it. Because basketball history is filled with incredible individual performances, ending in disappointing losses. One player can change a game. 5 connected players can change a season. Indiana needed everyone. Not just one star. Not just 2. Everyone. Kelsey Mitchell also began finding a better rhythm. Earlier in the game, she had been relatively quiet. Now she started attacking with more confidence. Her ability to score in isolation remains one of her greatest strengths. When she gets into rhythm, she can score in bunches. That's exactly what happened during portions of the second half. She created difficult shots. She finished through contact. She reminded everyone why defenses must always respect her scoring ability. On paper, that should have been enough. Clark creating. Boston finishing inside. Mitchell scoring. Cunningham providing energy. That sounds like the formula for success. Yet the scoreboard refused to reflect it. Every time Indiana made a run, the opponent answered. Every momentum swing lasted only a few possessions. It felt like climbing a hill while someone kept pushing you backward. Then came another stretch that had fans talking. The offensive flow suddenly changed. Instead of continuing to play through the actions that had worked earlier, possessions became slower again. The basketball stopped moving. Players held the ball longer. The pace disappeared. Instead of forcing the defense to react, Indiana allowed the defense to get comfortable. That difference may sound small. It isn't. Modern basketball rewards quick decisions. Pass. Cut. Drive. Kick. Move again. Constant movement creates confusion. Standing still creates predictable offense. Predictable offense becomes easier to defend. As those slower possessions increased, the Fever's momentum began fading again. Meanwhile, the defensive problems never fully disappeared. Closeouts came a step late. Rotations broke down. Rebounding became inconsistent. Every mistake gave the opponent another opportunity. At this level, extra possessions usually become extra points. That was exactly the story unfolding. Still, the game remained close enough to create hope. One big run could completely change everything. One defensive stop could energize the crowd. One three-pointer could shift momentum. That's why nobody felt ready to give up. Even after all the mistakes, even after all the defensive struggles, Indiana remained within striking distance. Much of that belief existed because Caitlin Clark was still on the floor. Fans have seen too many games where she completely changes the outcome during the closing minutes. A deep three, a perfect pass, a transition play, something unexpected. She has built that reputation through years of delivering under pressure. Every possession felt like it could become that moment. As the third quarter came to an end, there was still genuine belief that Indiana could steal the game. They hadn't played their best basketball. Far from it. But they were still there. Still fighting. Still close enough to make one final push. The fourth quarter would decide everything. Would Indiana finally put together a complete stretch of basketball? Would the defense finally produce the stops they desperately needed? Would the offense continue flowing through the players who had carried them all night? Or would another opportunity slip away? Nobody inside the arena knew the answer yet. But everyone understood one thing. The final 12 minutes were about to define the entire night. The fourth quarter arrived with everything still within reach. Despite all the defensive mistakes, despite the slow stretches on offense, despite never fully controlling the tempo, Indiana still had a chance. That's what made the situation so frustrating. This wasn't a game where the Fever had been completely outplayed from start to finish. They were close enough to win. They simply needed one great stretch. One run fueled by defense. One sequence where they imposed their will. Instead, the opposite happened. The energy that had finally started to build during the third quarter slowly faded. The offense became increasingly stagnant. Possessions took longer to develop. Instead of forcing the defense to react, Indiana allowed the defense to settle into position before attacking. That made every shot more difficult. Every drive became crowded. Every passing lane became smaller. The rhythm that had carried them earlier simply disappeared. Perhaps the biggest surprise was how little the offense flowed through Caitlin Clark during critical possessions. Through 3 quarters, she had been the engine of everything positive. She was creating shots. She was setting up teammates. She was pushing the pace whenever possible. She had already put together another outstanding performance. Naturally, many expected the ball to stay in her hands as the game entered its most important moments. Instead, the offense became far less organized. Some possessions ended with isolation plays. Others ended with contested jumpers. The movement that had briefly returned during the third quarter vanished again. From the outside looking in, it felt like Indiana drifted away from what had been working. That's always difficult for fans to understand. When one approach is producing results, people naturally wonder why it changes. Whether those decisions came from the coaching staff, player reads on the floor, or the opponent's defensive adjustments, the result was the same. The offense lost its flow. Meanwhile, the opponent continued playing with patience. They didn't rush. They didn't panic. They trusted their system. Every possession seemed designed with purpose. Even when they missed shots, they continued attacking with confidence. Indiana, on the other hand, looked like a team searching for answers. There were still flashes of brilliance. Aliyah Boston continued battling inside. She fought for position. She finished through contact. She gave Indiana valuable production near the basket. Kelsey Mitchell also remained aggressive. Whenever she found space, she attacked without hesitation. Her ability to create offense kept the Fever within striking distance. But basketball isn't won by individual highlights alone. It's won by consistency. And consistency was exactly what Indiana couldn't find. One possession looked sharp. The next looked rushed. One defensive stop was followed by an uncontested layup. One beautiful assist was erased by another breakdown on the other end. That pattern repeated itself throughout the quarter. The defensive issues became impossible to ignore. Opponents continued reaching the paint too easily. Help defenders often arrived just a moment too late. Closeouts lacked urgency. Rebounding battles became increasingly important. Every missed opportunity felt larger because the game remained so close. This wasn't a 20-point deficit. Every possession mattered. Every mistake carried extra weight. That's what made the ending so painful. The opportunities were there. Indiana simply couldn't capitalize. One moment perfectly captured the frustration surrounding the offense. After several successful possessions built around quick decisions and ball movement earlier in the game, the Fever returned to slower isolation basketball. One player held the ball. Teammates stood watching. The shot clock continued ticking. Eventually, someone attempted a difficult shot under pressure. Sometimes those shots went in. More often, they didn't. Great defenses actually prefer that style of offense. It allows them to stay organized. It removes constant movement. It limits confusion. Without off-ball screens, cuts, and quick passing, defenders don't have to make difficult decisions. Everything becomes simpler. That's exactly what happened during several key possessions late in the game. Fans watching could almost sense the momentum slipping away. The frustration wasn't simply about missed shots. It was about how those shots were created. Or perhaps more accurately, how they weren't created. The Fever have shown they can generate quality offense when everyone is involved. When the ball moves quickly. When players trust one another. When spacing creates driving lanes. That version of the offense barely appeared during the closing stretch. Still, Caitlin Clark refused to stop competing. Even without dominating every late possession, she remained active. She continued moving without the basketball. She looked for opportunities to create. She stayed engaged on both ends. That's one quality that consistently stands out. Regardless of the circumstances, she keeps competing. Every possession matters. Every loose ball matters. Every opportunity matters. That's the mentality fans admire. Unfortunately, effort from one player cannot erase team-wide mistakes. The defensive problems remained. Communication appeared inconsistent. Rotations continued breaking down. Easy baskets kept appearing at the worst possible times. When championship teams enter close fourth-quarter games, they often rely on defense to separate themselves. One stop becomes two. Two stops become a fast break opportunity. Momentum shifts. Crowds explode. Pressure changes sides. Indiana never found that sequence. Instead, they were constantly answering another score. That's exhausting, both physically and mentally. Playing from behind changes the entire rhythm of a game. Every possession starts feeling urgent. Every missed shot feels bigger. Every defensive mistake feels impossible to overcome. That pressure continued building as the clock wound down. The crowd desperately searched for one signature moment. One deep three. One huge defensive stop. One fast break finish. Something to ignite the arena. Those moments never fully arrived. Instead, the game slowly slipped away. Not because of one catastrophic mistake. Not because of one controversial play. But because of dozens of small moments spread across 4 quarters. One missed rotation. One offensive rebound allowed. One unnecessary turnover. One possession without ball movement. One missed closeout. One failed box out. Individually, those plays seem minor. Collectively, they determine outcomes. That's exactly what happened here. As the final minutes approached, Indiana still fought. Nobody questioned the effort during those closing possessions. Players continued attacking. They continued searching for opportunities. But the earlier mistakes had already created too much ground to recover. The opponent stayed composed. They made the plays they needed. Indiana simply ran out of time. When the final buzzer sounded, the feeling wasn't shock. It was disappointment. Not because the Fever lacked talent, not because they lacked scoring, but because this felt like a game they could have won. Fans immediately began asking difficult questions. Why did the offense lose its rhythm late? Why couldn't the defense find answers? Why did the team's intensity seem inconsistent throughout the night? Those questions would dominate conversations after the game. And honestly, they were fair questions, because expectations have changed. Indiana is no longer viewed as a rebuilding team hopping to compete. People now expect meaningful basketball. They expect discipline. They expect growth. They expect performances that match the talent on the roster. That's why losses like this feel different. They aren't simply disappointing. They feel like missed opportunities. And in a competitive league, missed opportunities can quickly become costly. The Fever still have plenty of basketball left to play. But if they want to become one of the league's most dangerous teams, performances like this cannot become the standard. The talent is there. The potential is obvious. Now comes the difficult part: turning potential into consistency. As the arena slowly emptied, the final score no longer felt like the biggest story. The numbers told one version of the game. The performance told another. Anyone who only looked at the box score might think Indiana simply came up short against a tough opponent. But fans who watched every possession knew the frustration ran much deeper than that. This wasn't about one missed shot. It wasn't about one bad call. It wasn't even about one player having an off night. It was about a team that never consistently played with the urgency the moment demanded. That's why so many conversations after the game focused on effort instead of statistics. Because effort is something every team can control. Shots will fall some nights and refuse to fall on others. Turnovers happen. Bad shooting nights happen. Even great players have games where nothing seems to work. But hustle, communication, defensive intensity, those things don't depend on luck. They depend on commitment. And that's exactly what many fans felt was missing. One of the biggest positives from the night remained Caitlin Clark's performance. She continued proving why defenses spend so much time preparing for her. Every possession began with opponents trying to figure out how to slow her down. Sometimes they trapped her. Sometimes they switched defenders. Sometimes they picked her up far beyond the three-point line. Despite all of that attention, she still found ways to produce. She scored. She created opportunities for teammates. She pushed the pace whenever possible. She never stopped competing. That kind of consistency is difficult to ignore. It's also one reason expectations continue rising. When your best player delivers another productive offensive performance, people naturally expect the team to capitalize. Unfortunately, basketball doesn't always work that way. One player can influence a game. A complete team wins games consistently. That's the challenge Indiana continues facing. The supporting pieces showed flashes throughout the night. Aliyah Boston battled inside from opening tip to final buzzer. She absorbed contact. She fought for position. She remained reliable around the basket. Her ability to score in the paint gave Indiana another offensive option whenever perimeter shots became difficult. Kelsey Mitchell also reminded everyone why she's one of the league's most dangerous scorers. Once she found her rhythm, she attacked aggressively. She created difficult shots. She made defenders work on every possession. When she's playing confidently, she changes the entire offense. Sophie Cunningham brought energy from the opening quarter. She knocked down early shots. She played with confidence. She hustled after loose balls. She embraced the physical side of the game. Those are valuable qualities every successful team needs. But as the game continued, her offensive opportunities became less frequent. Whether that happened because of defensive adjustments or changes within Indiana's offense, the result remained the same. The Fever lost one of their early sources of momentum. Beyond those performances, however, Indiana needed more consistent production across the roster. Winning basketball requires contributions from everyone. Sometimes it's scoring. Sometimes it's defense. Sometimes it's rebounding. Sometimes it's simply making the right play at the right moment. Championship-level teams understand that every possession belongs to all 5 players on the floor. That level of consistency still feels like a work in progress for Indiana. Another topic fans debated centered around offensive identity. What exactly does Indiana want its offense to become? At its best, the answer seems obvious. Play fast. Move the basketball. Use spacing. Create movement without the ball. Allow Caitlin Clark's vision to create opportunities before defenses can get organized. When the Fever play that style, they become incredibly difficult to defend. The pace creates confusion. The passing creates open shots. The constant movement forces mistakes. Everything feels connected. Unfortunately, that version of the offense only appeared in short stretches. Too often, possession slowed down. The basketball stopped moving. Players waited instead of cutting. Isolation basketball replaced quick decision-making. The difference may seem subtle. On the court, it changes everything. Fast-paced offense forces defenders into uncomfortable situations. Slow offense gives defenses time to prepare. One style creates pressure. The other relieves it. Throughout this game, Indiana spent too much time helping the opposing defense instead of challenging it. Then there was the defensive identity. Perhaps the biggest question of the night. Great defensive teams usually have recognizable characteristics. Some pressure the ball relentlessly. Others dominate the paint. Some force turnovers. Others control the defensive glass. Every successful defense has a personality. Indiana struggled to establish one. There were moments of aggressive pressure. There were moments of solid rotations. But they rarely lasted long enough to define the game. Instead, defensive possessions often felt reactive rather than proactive. The opponent dictated the action. Indiana responded. Elite defenses reverse that relationship. They force offenses into uncomfortable situations. They create hesitation. They disrupt rhythm. The Fever rarely accomplished that consistently during this game. As a result, the opponent played with increasing confidence. Confidence grows quickly in basketball. One open shot leads to another. One successful drive encourages the next. Before long, an entire offense begins playing freely. That's exactly what Indiana wanted to avoid. Unfortunately, it happened anyway. Another encouraging sign remained Caitlin Clark's continued willingness to expand her offensive game. Defenses have become increasingly determined to limit her three-point opportunities. That makes her development in other areas extremely important. Mid-range jumpers, attacking the basket, finishing through contact, making quick reads against double teams. Each new weapon forces defenses to adjust. The more complete her offensive game becomes, the more difficult she'll be to stop. That should excite Fever fans moving forward. Growth doesn't always happen through victories. Sometimes frustrating losses provide valuable lessons. This game offered plenty. The coaching staff now has film showing exactly where defensive communication broke down. Players can review missed rotations. They can study spacing. They can identify moments where better decisions might have changed the outcome. Those lessons only matter if they're applied. That's the challenge awaiting Indiana. The season isn't decided by one game. But habits are winning habits, losing habits, defensive habits, offensive habits. Every game reinforces something. The question now becomes which lessons the Fever choose to carry into the next matchup. Because talent alone won't be enough. Every team in this league has talented players. The difference usually comes from execution, discipline, consistency, and attention to detail. Those areas will determine how far Indiana can go. The opportunity remains right in front of them. The pieces are there. The potential is obvious. Now they must put everything together when it matters most. The next game offers another chance. Another opportunity to answer critics. Another opportunity to prove this performance was simply one disappointing night rather than a growing trend. Fans won't expect perfection. They never do. What they'll expect is visible improvement, greater energy, better communication, stronger defense, smarter execution. Most importantly, a team that looks determined from the opening tip until the final buzzer. Because if Indiana can match its talent with that level of commitment, the conversation surrounding this team could change very quickly. Now the attention shifts to what comes next. One disappointing performance doesn't define an entire season. Every team has nights where things don't click. Every contender experiences frustrating losses. The real difference is how they respond afterward. That's the challenge facing the Indiana Fever now. The questions surrounding this team aren't about talent anymore. Nobody doubts the roster has enough skill to compete. Nobody questions whether Caitlin Clark can lead an offense. Nobody wonders if Aliyah Boston can control the paint or if Kelsey Mitchell can put points on the board. The ability is there. The potential is obvious. What remains uncertain is whether this group can consistently put all the pieces together at the same time. Because that's what separates good teams from great ones. Great teams don't rely on one player having a spectacular night. They win because everyone understands their role. They defend with purpose. They communicate on every possession. They trust one another when games become difficult. Indiana is still searching for that level of consistency. One of the biggest lessons from this game is that offense alone isn't enough. The Fever scored efficiently for long stretches. They had multiple players producing. There were moments when the offense looked dangerous. Yet none of it mattered because the defensive effort never matched the offensive production. Basketball rewards balance. If you're scoring but constantly giving up easy baskets, you're running in place. Every great offensive possession loses value when the opponent answers immediately on the other end. That's exactly what happened throughout this game. Every time Indiana appeared ready to build momentum, another defensive breakdown erased it. Every time the crowd found its voice, another easy basket quieted the arena. Momentum never stayed long enough to change the outcome. That's why defensive improvement has to become the priority moving forward. Not because the offense doesn't matter, but because the offense has already shown signs that it can compete with anyone. The defense still has something to prove. Another important takeaway involves pace. When Indiana plays fast, they become much more difficult to guard. Caitlin Clark thrives in transition. Her vision creates opportunities before defenses get organized. Her passing opens the floor. Her shooting stretches defenses beyond their comfort zone. Everything flows more naturally. But when the pace slows, the game changes. Defenders settle into position. Passing lanes disappear. Drives become more difficult. Possessions become predictable. That slower style simply doesn't maximize the strengths of this roster. Finding the right balance between speed and control will be one of the biggest challenges moving forward. The Fever don't need to rush every possession. They simply need to avoid becoming stagnant. Movement creates opportunity. Standing still creates pressure. Throughout this game, there were too many stretches where the offense stood still. Another positive that shouldn't be overlooked was the continued chemistry developing between Clark and Boston. Whenever those two connected effectively, Indiana's offense looked far more balanced. Clark's ability to create space combined with Boston's presence inside gives the Fever two completely different ways to attack. That combination has the potential to become one of the league's most difficult matchups. Building around that partnership should remain a major priority. At the same time, the supporting cast has an equally important responsibility. Championship teams aren't carried by two players alone. Every role matters. Every rebound matters. Every defensive stop matters. Every screen. Every rotation. Every hustle play. Those details often decide games long before the final buzzer. Fans also understand that improvement isn't always immediate. Building a winning culture takes time. Learning how to close games takes experience. Developing trust between teammates happens through both victories and disappointing losses. This game may ultimately become one of those learning experiences. Sometimes the most valuable lessons come after difficult nights. Film sessions become more honest. Practices become more focused. Conversations become more direct. Those moments can strengthen a team if everyone responds the right way. The Fever now have that opportunity. They can treat this game as a warning, or they can allow the same mistakes to continue. The decision belongs entirely to them. For Caitlin Clark, this performance adds another chapter to a season filled with high expectations. She once again demonstrated why she remains one of the league's most exciting players. She scored efficiently. She created offense. She stayed aggressive. She continued competing regardless of the circumstances. Those qualities are exactly why fans continue filling arenas to watch her play. But even stars need help. No matter how talented one player may be, basketball has always been the ultimate team sport. Success depends on everyone moving together. Everyone sacrificing. Everyone committing to the same goal. That's where Indiana's biggest opportunity still exists. The individual talent has never been the question. The collective execution is. As the team prepares for its next game, all eyes will be watching for one thing. Not just whether they win, but how they play. Do they communicate better? Do they defend with greater intensity? Do they move the basketball more consistently? Do they respond when adversity appears? Those answers will reveal far more than one final score ever could. Because every season reaches moments where teams decide who they want to become. This feels like one of those moments for Indiana. They can choose frustration, or they can choose growth. They can point to missed opportunities, or they can turn those mistakes into improvements. The season is far from over. There are still plenty of games left to play. Plenty of opportunities to improve. Plenty of chances to prove that this performance was the exception rather than the standard. That's what makes sports so compelling. Every game writes a new chapter. Every challenge creates another opportunity. Every setback offers another chance to respond. The Fever now stand at that crossroads. The next performance will tell us whether they learned from this night, or whether the same questions will continue following them throughout the season. For now, one thing is certain. The talent is real. The expectations are higher than ever. And every game from this point forward will matter just a little bit more. If Indiana can match its offensive firepower with consistent defensive effort, they have every reason to believe they can compete with anyone in the league. But until that happens consistently, every victory will require extra effort, and every loss will leave fans wondering what could have been. The next game is another opportunity to answer those questions. Now it's up to the Fever to write a different story.